but I want to welcome you to the next session, which is ensuring clean and ethical business practices by reacting to the CSRD. My name is Phillip Cornell. I'm the Global Practice Lead for Energy and Sustainability at Economist Impact, and I'm very happy to be moderating this fireside chat today with Raphael Güller, who's the co-founder of SWEEP. And indeed, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive is ushering in a new era in Europe around disclosure, where businesses will be required to disclose, obviously, the ethical practices throughout their supply chain. And it really covers a very diverse area of metrics, from emissions, energy use, diversity, labor rights, and governance. So the question is, how are companies then navigating this challenge, which requires them to disclose these in 2025 and therefore start collecting data this year? What kind of partnerships will be needed to promote sustainable sourcing, and how are technological innovations such as blockchains or artificial intelligence enhancing supply chain transparency? So I'm very happy to have you, Raphael, here to discuss a little bit about that. So maybe we could just open. You could tell us a little bit about what the CSRD is, what its intention is, and then what is actually the potential that can be driven from it.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. And thanks for having me. And maybe just briefly, right? SWEEP, we are the sustainability data management platform. And so we help companies like L'Oréal, SSE, or BlackRock to track, disclose, and act, as we call it. And obviously that includes the CSRD. Around 50,000 businesses, right, across the EU and beyond will be impacted by this. For many, it's starting this year. So first reporting year is 2024, to be disclosed in 25.
That's right.
And if you're working for a UK business, chances are you might still be impacted, because if you have material business in the EU, you'll have to start reporting from 2026 over certain thresholds, right? If you're above 50 million in net revenue, for example, or 250 employees. And yeah, there's around 1,200 indicators, if you want, that you'll have to report on, right? So it's this massive sort of deluge of data points that you'll have to submit. We think there's around sort of 70% text responses, and then there's plenty of quantitative indicators within that. And yes, I think a lot of businesses are waking up to this reality.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, the goal here is to help drive more sustainable investment decisions and also open up transparency for customers. So again, what do you think is going to be sort of the potential from that, and what is the benefit then going to be to the market?
Yeah. And I think it's definitely fair if sort of the first reaction is panic, right? And there's potential for a lot of red tape. Personally, I'm very excited at the regulation. It's probably a dangerous thing to say at an economist conference. Regulation, great. But yeah, I do think there is actually a bit of a risk that businesses will spend sort of the bandwidth that they have allocated to take action, and they'll put that all now into the reporting, right? And making sure that those 1,200 indicators are properly documented. So I do think there's a slight risk there. And with SWEEP, our purpose very much is to help companies take action, not just report on the status quo. But I also do think it's a massive opportunity for businesses to start changing the way they do business. And I think in many ways we see sustainability as a mega trend, just like digitalization, a few years back, and that's impacted every single business, right? Whether you were, mailing out DVDs and now you're the largest streamer, or you're, a small restaurant down the road and now half your business comes from Deliveroo. I think every single business had to adjust how they run their business in a digital world, and we think the same is going to happen with sustainability. And so I think see it as an opportunity to get your house in order to, start, I think, looking at all these metrics just like you look at your financial metrics, right? And I think the businesses that sort of tackle that head on, I think they'll be the leaders of the future. Right? We call them forever companies, actually.
Well, let's talk about the intersection of these two megatrends, right? So you mentioned over 1,200 indicators, massive amounts of data points within each sort of company. How is new technology, for example, the use of AI in platforms like yours, helping companies to actually manage all of that data, sift through it, and then report on it?
Yeah. I'll come back to AI in a moment, and I'm really hyped about this. And you mentioned blockchain as well, and I'm Swiss. I'm quite pragmatic, so I don't get too hyped up about the latest new technology. I wasn't about blockchain, but I think AI is really a massive tool in our toolkit. Generally, we think this is a data problem, right? It's a data problem and the network problem. I think that gets us back to the supply chain topic. And so, yeah, there's massive amounts of data that we have to manage, right? That is within your organization, right? That's your sustainability team, your HR team. It's an IT project. Your finance team is probably going to be very involved because they know how to audit stuff and disclose it, right? So it impacts everybody. So coordination across your internal network, and then the same with your supply chain, right? Because the CSRD also includes, first the double materiality assessment on your supply chain, and then plenty of disclosures on that. And so, yeah, Sweep is a data platform, right? I think that's a key piece that you can, you have the granularity, so you can have the disclosure at the end, but you can also dig into your data and understand it and see the progress. Part of what you have to report in the CSRD is also not just the status quo, but your targets and your trajectory and your investments, right? I really think that's where this becomes a sort of a day-to-day business practice where you need to be able to monitor as well and understand the underlying data. So granularity, I think obviously the auditability, right? Being able to understand who has submitted what. Your auditors want to come in and understand how things have been calculated. There is the collaboration, as we just mentioned, right? How do you get the data from your teams, from your suppliers? That needs to be really secure, right? Particularly once you start exchanging data across company borders. And then that needs to be scalable, right? Regulation changes, adjusts, so you need that. And then finally, I think very important as well that you can scale to the amount of data that will flow in the system. With L'Oréal, for example, we're looking at millions of data points that flow through the system, and where we do dynamic computations on top. So I think you want to make sure that you have sort of the, it might look good at the surface though, but making sure you've got the solid foundation. And then, sorry, this is a long answer.
Please.
AI in this. I think data and AI, and there's definitely massive potential. I'll give you two examples, right? So one is injecting all that data, right? You throw in your files, whether that comes from your SAP, from your HR system, whether some of your staff manually enter data. So we can help you map that into the right categories, into the right places, right? And I think there's a lot of efficiency that can be gained there. And then on the other side of the spectrum, right, the qualitative responses, we have this, we would call it Sweepy, right, the assistant in Sweep that helps you get a draft response ready, right? So it has benchmark disclosures from companies, and it knows your data in the system, and it can pull sort of a first draft response for you. And obviously, we wouldn't recommend you to submit that right away, but it can really sort of help
Sure.
get you going. So that's just two examples. I think how that can really make a difference for you to move into action, hopefully as well, rather than...
Yeah, absolutely. I think we were talking about, some of the CSOs that the Economist collaborates with. We had a poll, and it showed that of the biggest priorities, out of the top 6, the top 3 were all about process in terms of investment, in terms of their priorities, only until you got about halfway down the list that there were actually actions that were impacting their business, impacting emissions, impacting a lot of the other elements. So getting that out of the way seems to be a big part of the problem.
Yeah, definitely. And then I think, taking action itself is, is obviously a big task as well. And so, setting your targets, assigning tasks, getting your different staff and teams involved. I think there's sort of a big coordination piece there as well, and I think tooling can help with that as well.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about coordination, particularly inside the supply chain. Yeah. So obviously, there's going to be uniformity of the reporting requirements. Over 50,000 companies fall under CSRD reporting requirements. But in terms of platforms and data management, you're not the only one out there. So how can platforms like yours or CSRD help companies to coordinate within their supply chains and manage things like scope 3 emissions or other kinds of questions that require that kind of collaboration?
Yeah. I think for starters, it's really important that the data flows, right? Because inevitably there's going to be different companies, different sizes, different industries, and different tooling. And so with Sweep as well, data in, data out, the data is yours. I think, that we're all in this together to make a difference, and the data needs to flow. But clearly, there's benefits on the shared tooling. And so what we do in our supply chain module is that we'd start you off with benchmark data, so you can sort of do a quick hotspot analysis, and then from there we're very very conscious that not one size fits all, right? With SNCF, for example, the French railway company, there's thousands and thousands of suppliers that they want to track in the system. And so there's no way you can have sort of a really detailed exchange of data with all of these, right? And so I think, and often we see companies sort of do a quadrant where, you sort of look at where can I have material impact on the business and also where does it actually matter for my footprint. And you'll find these strategic suppliers where you want to go really deep, and you might actually exchange super granular data right down to the materials or whatnot that you're using, so you can work on that together, and you can set targets and share those and then see the progress. And then I think there's sort of this long tail of suppliers where you might just want to give them a bit of, it's more the carrot and the stick, maybe you want to give them, a bit of tooling so they can report better. With Sweep, we have a free plan, right? So if you ask them for data, they'll have their own instance of Sweep, and they can sort of, over time, start migrating into the full ecosystem and start tracking better as well, which then obviously benefits your footprint.
Yeah. I mean, we've talked a little bit in the past at The Economist about platform dynamics, right? And that you actually have sort of effective a consolidation at the sort of platform or technical level. So you have somehow standardization from both sides. That seems to be one of the dynamics that you're trying to ride.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when we started, we thought, wow, this is a network problem, right? And we're going to switch this on and everybody's going to be on it. We're not quite there yet, but we can see it happen, right? And so we have these moments now where, we onboard a new customer and we start looking at their partners, and we realize, oh, wow, some of these suppliers of theirs are already in the system and are reporting. And then in that instance, if they get a data request, they can just resubmit the data they've already submitted previously. So yeah definitely.
This applies to companies that are based in the EU, but also have, as you mentioned, substantial operations inside the European Union. This is just the first mover. I mean, we talk about the EU being sort of a regulatory superpower or a first mover. How do you see sort of the CSRD affecting other mandatory requirements that were starting to pop up in other parts of the world? And do you see consolidation happening on that level as well?
Yeah. We'll see, right? But I do think there is sort of a real potential that this will become the regulation. I think it's the first big mandatory piece of regulation, and we've seen it, with the GDPR, for example, as well, where that sort of became the globally adopted framework. And yes, I mean, for example, the GRI, already announced their interoperability with the CSRD. So yeah, I wouldn't magically, think that all these standards are going to be exactly the same. And so I think the mapping there we'll see, but clearly I think the EU might sort of become the de facto piece of regulation there. And I think even if in 2026 you won't have to report, I still think, through those value chains, it will sort of trickle down. And it might be easier to just start doing it the CSRD way, because it will be the dominant framework.
Mm-hmm. We're going to open up for questions with a few minutes. So I think you can ask questions either through Slido or in the room. So just have a think about that. And I'll just ask you a last question while people are thinking. Obviously, the transparency that CSRD is meant to deliver is also supposed to be helping consumers themselves, right? To be making more transparent decisions in order to sort of bypass things like greenwashing. How do you see this and sort of your technology benefiting day-to-day consumers? How can they interact directly?
Yeah, I mean, transparency obviously is a major lever, I think, to start improving. I think in the previous panel we also talked about, the quality of the data and how do you know. So, once there's for all these companies, there's 1,200 data points, publicly available from Brussels. I think that's a major shift for sure. There's other laws like, the greenwashing law, for example. I think that was ratified in January this year. That sort of tackled this from another angle. Again, back to the forever company piece, I think ultimately as businesses, we want to understand, how we operate our businesses. We want to understand our metrics. I think we're quite good at that already on the financial side. Now I think we're talking about up-leveling the extra financial, controlling essentially in our companies to a similar level, right? I think also with similar amount of possibly bandwidth it requires and infrastructure and the audits, etc. And I would think that's a good thing, right? If as a business leader I can better understand how my companies run and I can improve it, right? So I would say definitely customers, right? 85% of EU consumers, consider themselves sustainably minded and care. Great that the regulators are coming in as well, but I think ultimately as businesses, that's day to day, right? What we should do, innovate and learn and understand our data.
Great. We have a first question here. How do you source data to satisfy the requirement to measure impact on stakeholders, such as affected or fence-line communities?
Yeah. So I think we heard it in the previous panel as well, right? So there's, I think a lot of the data that we have, might be sort of at varying levels of accuracy. Even on the carbon side, right? It's always like, on the financial side, $1 is $1. On the carbon side, it's always sort of varying degree of estimates. Obviously, I think the more detailed and the more granular you can get, that's useful. But we also often say that if you spend too much time sort of measuring, the points after the comma, you're wasting your time, and it's sort of almost a bit of greenwashing as well, because you could spend this time on something that's meaningful. Because I think the materiality assessment is really key, right? And then I think, as we had it with the the supply chain, that you actually focus on the areas where it is really strategic for you, and there you go deep, right? And there you put in the effort, and depending on the data set, that might be that you have benchmark data you can tap into. There might be data you already have in your data systems. You might have to generate new data, right? With Sweep, you can run surveys, for example, that you might send to 1 or 2 suppliers or to 20,000 of your staff, and you can generate that data from scratch.
Great. A question here about competitors. How big is the market? How much room is there in the market? Back to our conversation sort of about platforms. The burden on suppliers to be on multiple platforms seems high.
Yeah, fair point. So I think for starters, it shows that there is a market, which is wonderful, right? And we see it from all sides. Consultants who've been in the space for a long time, startups like ours, sort of the old data players that are in there. So that's great, and I think the cake is growing. So I think there's space for a few. Also, again, different specializations, different industries. We're more sort of an aggregator, for larger companies and the networks. You might go really deep in a vertical like retail. And again, I think it's really key though that the data flows, right? And yes, I think there is benefits in networks, but also it can be that you have to be in a platform to report. And I think we can already see it across these supply chains. A lot of suppliers receive a lot of questionnaires, and they're all kind of sort of the same. They ask for the same, but they're slightly different. And so yeah, I think it's important that you can export data, that you can import it again, and that we don't create borders.
Probably something as well where AI and this sort of qualitative reading can help to consolidate a lot of that automatically. Maybe a last question here. CSRD is one regulation. How do you keep up with the onslaught of other regulations coming down the line? And how do you know which ones are applicable to your business? This materiality question that you were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, and materiality is usually sort of a step further. And once we know we need to do the CSRD based on it's the size of your company or your revenue, your location, and you'll know whether you'll have to report or not. And then you do the materiality on those 1,200 indicators and which ones you'll actually have to report on. But yeah, I mean, we call it again, load once, report everywhere. So there's sort of mapping already provider in the works between standards. We're doing some of that in Sweep as well. And I think, what you want to do is you want to build out your indicators and then sort of slot them into the right places so you don't start from scratch every single time again. And I think that's where the data platform piece comes into play again, right? You load your data, you structure it, you go through the approval steps, etc., and then you disclose it into those different frameworks.
Great. Well, it seems like the addition of the right technology can help to make sure that additional regulations like these ones aren't just taking huge amounts of resources and become a box checking exercise. So maybe it's a moment where we can actually benefit from that regulation thanks to the tools we have to deal with it. So anyway, Raphael, Güller, thanks so much for joining me for this fireside chat. It's been really a pleasure to have you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Great.
Thanks for listening. Cheers.